You'll master the art of balance with clubs, internships, work, athletics, community service, and adjuncts. Welcome to block breaks. You might notice that the campus is pretty quiet this morning because our block break started yesterday at 12:01, and that will continue through Sunday. So students are all over, some hiking 14ers, some camping, some visiting other parts of the Southwest. And welcome to our vibrant community, a community of 2,000 students who are eager to communicate, debate, defend, think, and engage. But the conversations don't stop when you leave the classroom, but expand into every corner of campus, and friends and peers relentlessly urge you to think outside the box, prosper, expand your views. When you're a student at CC, you have 32 blocks for unearthing your passions, exploring and understanding the world, and your individual growth. And because you all live here in Colorado, we have the Colorado Pledge, which I encourage you to look into if you have interest in attending Colorado College. So in short, welcome to CC.
Good morning, students and guests. My name is Karen Burkhart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're so pleased to see you all here. On behalf of the Council, I'm honored to welcome you to our annual high school symposium, Global Population, Fertility, Mortality, and Migration. Before going further, I want to thank our event chairperson, Professor Joe Dradinsky, and all at Colorado College who have made today's event possible. Help me recognize them. We have students from 7 high schools here today. Let's give a shout out to Air Academy High School, Sciubba Charter High School, Discovery Canyon, Lewis Palmer High School, Pine Creek High School, and Village High School. It is truly inspiring to see so many bright young minds gathered here today, ready to engage in the important conversations that shape our world. This symposium provides a unique opportunity to explore one of the most pressing issues facing our global community, population growth, and its far-reaching impacts on society, the environment, and future generations. Our world is now home to over 8 billion people, and this number continues to rise. With this growth come opportunities, but also challenges such as resource management, urbanization, public health, and sustainability. Understanding how these factors interconnect is crucial if we want to ensure a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future. You, the students, represent the next generation of leaders, thinkers, and change makers. Today is not just about absorbing information, but about questioning, challenging ideas, and developing your own perspective on global issues. The discussions and insights shared here will help shape how we address population-related challenges and how we build solutions that work on a local, national, and international scale. Throughout the day, we hope that you will be curious, open-minded, and fearless in sharing your thoughts. You have the power to influence change, and this symposium is your platform to start thinking about how you will contribute to a better future for everyone. Thanks for being here, and let's make today an inspiring and thought-provoking experience.
On a more administrative side, please look at your programs. But here again is our schedule. From 8:30 to 9:30, we have our keynote, which is going to begin momentarily, followed by a short break. Then we'll have a panel discussion. Then we'll have another break, which will then lead to roundtable discussions where you meet with your small groups. And then you're going to come back here. And then one of you from each group will have the opportunity to stand at this podium and report on your roundtables. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Sciubba. Dr. Sciubba is one of the foremost experts in the field of political demography. Dr. Sciubba argues that a deeper understanding of fertility, mortality, and migration trends point us toward the investments we need to make today to shape the future we want tomorrow. The central theme of her latest book, 8 billion and counting. In general, Dr. Sciubba works to educate the broader public about the importance of population trends by translating research for readers of some of the U.S.'s most esteemed publications, including The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, The Washington Post, and On the TED Stage, which I recommend viewing as policy-relevant research across a variety of publications. Dr. Sciubba is affiliated with the Wilson Center and the Hess Center for New Frontiers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, both in Washington, D.C. She's formerly a tenured professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the nation's leading liberal arts colleges. Dr. Sciubba has studied at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock, Germany, and served as a demographics consultant to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And I wish me luck as I make this transition to Zoom. Please, let's welcome Dr. Jennifer Sciubba. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Okay, how's it sound? Good?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, and you guys are on campus at Colorado College, right? I was just realizing that there's a picture behind my head of me with my friend who I used to teach at Rhodes College with, who's now a professor at Colorado College. So that's kind of nice. I'm sort of there with you, I suppose, in that way. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Karen, for the invitation. And I'm excited to talk to you about my favorite subject. Most people think, oh, populations is going to be boring, but as you'll see from our time together, it's the foundation of everything else about society. It's people. We're workers, we're soldiers, we are retirees, we're mothers, fathers, sisters, etc. We kind of are what makes the world go around. So I think that a deeper understanding of population trends really gives us a deeper understanding of everything else, every other subject we would study. So let me start with let me get my little PowerPoint up for you. I'm going to tell you a story about my own time in college. This should be pretty quick to get this up here. There you go. We'll do some myths, if I can talk today, and misconceptions about global population. Okay, so when I was a college student in 1999 in the fall, I was sitting in my favorite professor's class. It's like it was an Asian history class. And she was late. She was always late to class, but she was especially late on this one day. And we were used to eccentric behavior, but when she finally arrived, she stopped in the doorway until we all looked at her and we could see that she was wearing this black armband. And then she started marching military style in front of our desks, and she said, "Today, world population has hit 6 billion people. This is an absolute travesty for our planet. I never had children because there are too many people, and you shouldn't either." Now, this is the kind of things you cannot say in this century to students, but I was really intrigued, to say the least, by her complete commitment to this idea that she would change her life around this idea. And I didn't heed this warning. I have 2 children of my own, but I did end up with a career where I constantly question and study this relationship between people and our planet. And so I think there's one update possibly to my bio that I've taken a new role at the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C. It's a boring sounding name, but PRB, and we have been around for 94 years doing the same thing, looking at the relationship between population and work, population, the environment, etc. So when I was hooked by this idea on population, that it would be such a powerful thing. And by the time the world hit 7 billion people, I was a college professor myself and teaching environmental studies. And I've told a really different story about global population. That's because global population has actually really changed, even in my own lifetime. And it actually, given your ages, even in your own lifetime. So first I wanted to just say quickly how we have overall population change. It's very easy. There are really just 3 ingredients that I actually in my head picture as dials on a radio, like a car radio. There's the births part, the death part, and the migration part. Now, if we're talking about globally, we're not in the migration part of that yet, but we, at the national level, or state level, we would be thinking about that. And they can turn up or down in different intensities that would give us different outcomes. So you might have high births and high deaths and no population growth as early humans would have had. All of those together have led to some major shifts in global population that you're probably pretty familiar with. It took all of human history until around the year 1800 for Earth to house its first 1 billion people. And if you've ever taken any kind of human geography class, you may have heard about Thomas Malthus, who wrote his famous essays on the principles of population right around the time Earth hit 1 billion people. And in it, he argued that reproduction was too high and we would run out of food for everyone. We would have, tragedy awaiting us. Again, an echo, actually, of what I was told in 1999. Just 123 years later, much faster, we see our second billion, and then just 33 years later, our third billion. And that got faster, that growth really, became exponential because we were able to get control over that second dial, particularly infant and child mortality. So we helped people live longer, they lived into their reproductive ages, and then therefore population grew dramatically. At the start of last century, it was 1.6 billion, to the end, that fated day for me, of 6.1 billion by the end of it. Now, I said I was a college professor by the time we hit 7 billion. By the time we hit 8 billion, I had actually transitioned careers again, and that was just in 2022 to writing and speaking full-time before taking this position. So you'll see that's another 2 billion people that have been added to the population just since then. This is pretty common knowledge, right? So we're not really on the myths and misconceptions yet. All right, this is overall about size of population. But often, we're more interested in the composition of a population. So one way to think about that composition is by age structure. So if you kind of picture a society and you line everybody in the society up from the youngest person to the oldest person, you ask the person in the middle to raise their hand. How old are they? And how has that changed over time? Well, globally, we are a larger population, as we've just said. We're also a much older population. The age of the person in the middle would just keep going up, up, up over the years. In 1950, when global population was 2.5 billion people, the age structure of the planet was really bottom heavy, meaning that there were a lot of young people. So we get what's called a population pyramid. You may have even had these in math class. I have a child in 7th grade math who's already starting to learn some of these things. So you can be familiar with that. We call them pyramids because typically country profiles looked similar. By the time we get to 2023, we had 8 billion people on the planet, but you can see a much curvier age structure where you can tell that the center of gravity is at older ages, and it becomes more of what we would call a stovepipe shape, the straight up and down. We need to pick a new term for that because I don't know how many people under the age of 40 think about stovepipes, so I'm going to think of something else. If you have something in mind, you can just say it during the Q&A. And then by the end of this century, we expect an even older population that becomes potentially even an inverted pyramid shape. Probably not as dramatic as a pyramid, but you can see this narrowing there at the bottom. And we will very likely have around 10 billion people in the world. Now that's a number you should be keeping in mind because it's not that much larger than where we are now. All right, this is globally what it looks like. We also see this at the country level as well. So today, Ethiopia has what we would call above replacement fertility. And by the way, here's a quick note. I'm going to keep saying fertility rates instead of birth rates because that's actually the more accurate term for what I'm talking about. But you can just sub in your head birth rates. Birth rates are often measured as births per 1,000 women of reproductive ages. And they can depend on how many women in that society are of reproductive ages. So if they're not very many, even if they have a lot of children each on average, birth rate would be low. So that's a tough one to use. It's better to use total fertility rate, which is one number, average number of children born per woman in her lifetime that we can compare around the world. Replacement rates, roughly 2, right? 1 for each parent. So when we see Ethiopia and this pyramid shape, we know they're above 2 or above 4. And so they've got this classic pyramid shape, lots of young people. Turkey has been right around replacement rate, is now dipped below, and has the same shape to the population the overall population had, whereas Japan already has this inverted shape. They have had below replacement fertility rates for a really long time, and so they have a very top-heavy older population. So, myth number one is actually to go back to what my professor said. I came of age, think about what you learn in high school and college, in a time where global population was really booming, as I said, from 1.6 billion to 6.1 by the end of that century. But it is a myth today that global population is booming. We're not in the same world as 1999. In fact, the rate of global population change has been falling since the 1960s. And my TED Talk was referenced in the introduction. You'll see if you do watch that, they're much shorter now, it's just 10 minutes, that's how I started, is talking about how we see lots of people piling on the planet, but what we don't necessarily see are these tectonic forces underneath with the rate of change really slowing. The year 1968 is another one you could have heard about in human geography class, because this is when the famous book, The Population Bomb, was published by Paul Ehrlich. And this was really an echo of Malthus that I mentioned from 1800 that said, actually he said, we're breeding ourselves into extinction. And it was this argument that reproduction was so high, human reproduction, that it was outpacing our food supply and there would be mass starvation, overpopulation of the planet. At the time Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, lots of countries, the majority, over 120 out of 200, had really high population, had really high fertility. The number of countries where women had 5 or more children on average was over 120. By 2023, now, 8 countries have rates that high. So 120 to 8. It's really changed. In fact, 2 out of every 3 people on the planet, so 2 out of 3 of our 8 billion live somewhere with below replacement fertility rates. That also, though, means, which I'm going to flag for us, 1 out of 3 lives somewhere above. But 2 out of 3, we have this movement towards these older populations. When we start to zoom in, though, we see some really big differences. Globally, a quarter of us are children under the age of 15. Well, 10% are above age of 65. But the youngest region in the world is sub-Saharan Africa, where 42% of the population is children. The oldest region is Western and Southern Europe, probably will soon be East Asia, where 21% is over age 65. We can see this on a map as well, and I'm sure this doesn't surprise you. Places in blue have lower fertility rates. Those in red have higher fertility rates. It is higher where poverty is greater, where access to education is more limited, where opportunities to earn money outside the home are less, where child marriage is a common practice as well. But I will point out, look at the variety within sub-Saharan Africa. Things are changing around the world in many ways. So it's a myth that global population is booming, but also it is important to note that 2 things can be true at once. We have this overall shift to lower fertility rates. In fact, we have 50 shrinking countries right now. But we also still have areas in the world with really rapidly growing populations, very young populations. And so, in a way, we have this demographic divide. And there's lots of ways to slice up the divide. The best way is actually 3 buckets of countries, but we're going to keep it super simple and just say higher versus lower. Population growth, the future population growth that we will see, you'll see in your lifetime and I will see in mine, more than half of it comes from countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And this region is on track to add nearly 1 billion people. Over 40% of their growth comes from just 4 countries. So the populations of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, those are countries that will drive the increase in global population growth. So you may be sitting here thinking, and in fact, I hope you'll ask about this or challenge this during the Q&A portion. Let's go back to what your professor said about there being too many people. I know young people are super concerned about the environment today. Thank you for that. And so how does all of this come together? Well, like I said, two things can be true at once. We have 50 shrinking countries, but let's take one of the countries, one of the 8, where women still have 5 or more children on average, Nigeria. At a global level, I would not say that we're overpopulated. We can talk about that. But at a local level, the pressures that the pressures on the environment from population are tangible. People notice them in food shortages, water shortages, pressures on housing, jobs. And Nigeria is one of these countries where the size of the land isn't going to change, but the population is still growing rapidly. In fact, we will see Nigeria become the world's 3rd most populous country, overtaking the United States there. They have one of the highest fertility rates in the world, and 70% of the population still relies on fuel wood for heating and cooking. So imagine, we needed to make dinner tonight. We need to go gather wood from around, or, chop down a tree or a bush. The environmental impact of that is really dramatic. So they see these pressures on the environment. So, global population is not booming, but it's still growing for a little while longer. And there is a divide in places. That's myth number 1. Myth number 2 is probably much more surprising than that one. And for it, I'm going to ask you a pop quiz. There's no way I'll be able to hear you, but you should yell it out anyway to each other. And that's, what proportion of the world's 8 billion people do you think lives outside the country in which they were born? Maybe I can hear you. I'll leave it. Okay, since I can't hear you, I'll tell you the common responses. In the 20s is the most common response I get, somewhere around 20%. Sometimes people will get it right. Maybe the more I'm giving this talk, maybe the rumor's making it around. I've given this talk in Silicon Valley before, which has really high immigration rates, and people have said 50%, which this is telling, because it's actually the myth that international migration is common is really pervasive. But that's our second myth, because just 2 to 4% of the world's population lives outside the country in which they were born. These days, or a little, for decades, since the 60s. We're closer to the 4% now, but again, just 4%, under 4% of the world's population lives outside the country in which they were born. That means there's actually really a bias towards staying in the world. Over 96% of people still live where they were born. But we think that it is much more common, and there are several reasons why. One would be media coverage. Another is, if we're located in the United States, we would feel that way. The US has the world's largest stock of migrants. About 50 million people. And of all the migrants in the world, 2/3 of them live in just 20 countries. More than half are in just 10 countries. So that 4% of people, roughly 300 million people worldwide who have moved, are not evenly spread out in the world. And let's look at the United States for just a moment. So the US population, as you may or may not know, it is still growing, but our total fertility rate, average number of children born per woman in her lifetime, is well below replacement. It's about 1.6 children born per woman in her lifetime. So in the United States, when we're at the US level, I actually don't find it that helpful to understand population trends because they really differ by region. So the Northeast last year is a region of the US that it shrank. The Midwest barely grew. The West barely grew. Colorado in there as just a snail's pace of growing. But the US South, which I am sure you can hear in my accent, I am from and have lived in for the last 16 years before moving here to DC, is the only region that grew. And about 700,000 people were added to the Southeast last year from other places in the US. So the South is attracting people to move there from elsewhere. And about 500,000 international migrants settled in the US. So what this means for the US is, and same as other countries, is remember those 3 dials at the beginning: fertility rates, mortality rates, migration. how the population changes depends on what settings those dials are turned to. We've just said fertility rates are down. They're low. They're not going to go up. We can talk about that too. The middle, deaths, little asterisk here. The U.S. is not great on this compared to other countries of our income level, but overall, life expectancy in our 70s, that's fine. And migration dial is turned up for the U.S. That determines what the U.S. population will look like in the future. So here's some projections. By the way, population projections, way more reliable than, say, projecting inflation or housing prices or any of that. And all the economists, sorry to you if you're in the audience, who have it a lot harder. For us, the people of the future are mostly already born, especially if we don't go out very far. So we tend to know some of these things. Now, immigration is actually a political issue, not a demographic issue, in the sense that what turns the dial. But we know some things about migration and what it would look like for the U.S. under different scenarios. So if there's a lot more migration, more than now, U.S. population between now and the end of the decade, it'll grow by about 30%. If the U.S. immigration stays about like it has been, let the past be a predictor of the future, U.S. population would grow by around 10%. If it drops, we only shrink by 4%. And if we stopped everything today, and I love scenarios where you say, if everything stopped today, or if everything was the same as today, if it stopped, we would shrink by 32%. So this is an is for you to do with what you will. My organization does no advocacy. We are just, here's the data and evidence, you take it and you make the policies you want with it. But it's pretty interesting to think about putting the U.S. in context and how global fertility rates shifting does make the death dial and the migration dial, it gives it more visibility in terms of policy making. All right, last little quick slide on the U.S. is just who's growing and who's not. Pink is actively shrinking. So you can see this, pink is actively shrinking. Neutral colors are barely growing. And then the green are places that have been growing more. Now you're gonna notice like, what's going on with Montana and South Dakota? You'll expect to see these change in a couple of years because some of it had to do with some energy booms. And so driven economically. All right, last myth. Global population is all bad news. Having spent a long time in college, taught college for about 15 years, and I taught environmental studies, my students originally had named my courses, one in particular, the Apocalypse course. It seemed like we had nothing but bad news to share. And when you think about the environment, it can often feel like that. And also you think about how hot it is outside and you think, oh yes, this is the evidence of this. Well, I hear a lot about how young people view the future, and it seems to be mostly negative. That actually shows up in low fertility rates. Again, something we could talk about if it's of interest to you in Q&A, but to bring a child into the world requires a certain kind of faith in the future. And young people today have often been saying, at least in surveys, that they don't feel really positive about the future. And therefore, they're kind of like my professor in 1999 and thinking about their own family choices around that. I want to make sure you know that global population is not all bad news. Let's think of the death dial. The chance of the average New Yorker living to adulthood in the 19th century was pretty low. 6 in 10 would live to adulthood. That's not great. Now it's almost everybody. I just colored like the head of one person black because it's, you're almost guaranteed to live to adulthood. We as humans have added the equivalent of an extra life onto life expectancy in the last couple of centuries. That's the death dial. The fertility dial. Lower fertility rates overall are actually evidence of a positive trend because in the past, when you weren't sure if your child would make it to adulthood, you would have more children to kind of like as an insurance around that. Now, if you have just one child, you can be confident, in most cases, that they will make it to adulthood. The odds are in your favor there. So when I zoom out and look at these rates, I think this is great news. In fact, one of the reasons that the total fertility rate in the US is 1.6 is that teen pregnancies are down. Again, so it's not all bad news. And in fact, we've got some great news even on the global development front. And I'm gonna recommend a web page to you here. So here's one piece of good news you might not hear. Over 200 million school children have gained access to improved water, sanitation, or hygiene in the last 8 years. Now remember, there's 300 million global migrants. So when I say 200 million school children, this is a significant number. I really love, as a news source, Fix the News. The same year I spoke at TED, Angus Hervey, whose name is down there, also spoke. And his TED Talk is about 10 minutes, and it's on the good news. And he sits at a news desk, and he talks about all the good news you may have missed. I am in a business where we work on global development. We use population data to improve people's well-being worldwide. So for us, it's in our best interest to talk about the bad news a lot of the time, so we can get more funding to bring this kind of hygiene to even more children, to improve lives even more. But it's absolutely true that even though there's great need out there, we have come a really long way. So I'd like for you to leave with a very positive view of overall population. When I wrote my last book, which was 8 billion and counting, so I've got marking that milestone, by the time I finished, I felt so optimistic about global population, despite all of the things in the book that maybe didn't point to the positives. The good news is there if you look for it. So, where do we go from here? I said before that I thought we would end up somewhere around 10 billion people. And so in your lifetimes, it's just really remarkable that you'll see the peak of global population and probably a decline. These days, they're putting its best projections, the ones I buy into, are around the year 2080 for that to happen. Depending on how fast those fertility rates in those few countries that were still high, depending on how fast those come down and whether or not they stay really low in the places where they're really low, it could be sooner than 2080. But that is not the number to focus on. And as you go through your studies, particularly if they take you anywhere adjacent to these issues, remember that zooming in, you learn a lot more about population than even staying at this big global level. You've got to have both, because 10 billion is an aggregate of 10 billion individual people who have their own religions and politics and choices and occupations and educations. And I think we need to always be going from the individual to the aggregate and back and forth to make sure we're learning everything we can about that. I often try, and my next book will be about this, to shift our conversations away from just the numbers to thinking about, so what? What do they mean? And that's part of what we do here at PRB, is we really contextualize data. The longer that I do this, the more I see that real change, the so what, making the so what better, happens at the community level. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you today, but I travel around, especially to World Affairs Councils, to give talks all sorts of places. This year I've been to Peoria, Traverse City, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Charleston. I'm going to Maine next week. And that is where change really happens. So if you're a globally minded person, don't think that you have to be somewhere out there in the globe for these issues to matter. Having strong workplaces, communities, schools, that is where I really see the biggest impact on mediating the impact of population trends. So I will point you to one last resource. Here at PRB, our famous World Population Data Sheet, which some professors who are sitting there may have used before, even some teachers. It's been going for 60 years running, and it just came out this week on Monday. So you can just find us at prb.org and find that data sheet, which lots of more information. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions, even about my career, PRB, any of those things. Thanks.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We are ready to take questions now. We have 2 microphones. Erin is turning them on here. So, okay, good. Please line up if you have a question, and we will start left to right. Usually this is not a shy group.
This means we solved all the work, we busted all the myths, so.
There we go.
I'm also happy to hear anybody's views on these things, because I can learn something from you.
Yeah.
Can I just move it down? I am way too short for this microphone. Anyways, hello. So, I'm kind of curious on something from a personal standpoint because I was adopted from a different country. How do adoption rates of kids from different countries play into the global population?
Such a good question. Well, the really true answer is our numbers for population are always guesses anyway. So, yay for statistics. And I know that this is what my 7th grade math student is learning is about samples and populations. So how we know things about population is there are often surveys done of samples within a country, and then you kind of aggregate from the sample. We add in there as well records on, they're like vital statistics records, so like counties, hospitals, government agencies will have numbers as well. So when we make this world population data sheet, our head demographer gathers all of that information and then gives a best guess about what population looks like. That's a long answer to say, I couldn't say how you were ever counted. You were probably counted as a birth in the birth country, but then now counted in the US Census in our numbers. So it's kind of a double count, but probably no longer counted depending on what records have been kept as being in that birth country.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question though. Tough question.
How does migrating populations and the growing population impact urbanization versus rural communities?
Great question as well. So we have seen a shift globally from rural to urban. In many parts of the world, like Europe, for example, they're already what we would call saturated in terms of urban populations, meaning the proportion of people who would want to move have already moved. In the US, though, we still see, I think this is like a little, there's like a bias to phrasing it this way, but in the media it's always phrased as an emptying out of America's rural populations. That's still the case. I know when I do travel around, a lot of places are worried, in particular about the young people who are leaving to go to urban areas. Now the pandemic, we saw a reversal of that. So New York City saw an emptying out. Actually, we have beautiful brand new offices here at PRB because our old office, it got turned, like real estate changed in urban areas because people emptied out and we could save a bunch of money because supply and demand changed so much. So both things are happening at the same time as far as the US. And we don't know how it's going to go in the future because I think we're really still dealing a lot in terms of data with what does post-COVID look like. You know, you saw maybe your headlines yesterday that Amazon called everybody back to work in the office. Those kinds of things will actually change where people live. So TBD, a couple more years to see what it looks like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we know if ever the world would reach its carrying capacity with the amount of growth that this population is making?
That's a great question, and so I have a really different view than maybe other people would. I don't find carrying capacity, despite teaching environmental studies for so long, I don't find it a useful term because it doesn't really give us ownership over our own consumption. So if you think about a place like, really at the end of the day, I think with carrying capacity, we often think about total numbers of population. Already in the world, with 2 out of 3 people living let's actually take India. This is gonna be the easiest one. India, we think of, actually it's the country that Paul Ehrlich wrote the population bomb about in 1968. It's a high fertility rate. India has the low replacement fertility rate. So if you're thinking about something like overpopulation as the problem, the solution is often slow population growth. Well, what if fertility rates are already low, what are you supposed to do about it then? So I don't like carrying capacity because it says population size is a problem, but in a lot of places, fertility rates are already down. So I think it's better for us to focus on consumption. I don't think we should rest on our laurels that, 50 shrinking countries and most of them are rich, that means their environmental impact will go down. Maybe. But also governments are worried that shrinking populations mean lower economic growth, so they're pushing for more consumption. So the short answer, I would say, is we're only adding 2 more billion people on the planet. Carrying capacity of local areas, like I mentioned with Nigeria, is the place to focus on. But if we're at the global level, we need to think a lot more about consumption and not size.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Logan Richardson. I'm from Sciubba Charter High School. You had said that immigration and population is not political, or it is political and not demographic. What do you think are the first steps to kind of change that idea in our population? Because I know you also said just now that we should be focusing more on the areas that we are seeing population growth in and not focusing on global population as a whole. So what are those first steps?
You know, that is such a tough one. I went to Indianapolis recently and spoke at what did they call it? It's almost like a World Affairs Center. Global something. It had a cool name. I wish I could tell you so you could look it up. But Indianapolis Global Community something. And actually, if you could ever visit there, it would be great. At the community level, in Indianapolis, they had a really rundown area with no economic activity. It was kind of just neglected. And instead, they turned this into an immigration hub for businesses, for education, field trips, for hosting meetings, for really working on, at the community level, talking about the ways that the different population groups contributed to a vital Indianapolis. When we're at the national level talking about immigration, it doesn't look anything like that, right? I don't actually see a way forward. I'm so sorry, I said I was going to be positive. I don't see any way forward at the national level on immigration. I think it is I'm a political scientist, by the way. That's what my Ph.D. is in. I think it is built into the system that there are no incentives for politicians to break out of that here, in Europe, elsewhere. But at the community level, things sound really different. So that's actually another reason why I've started to shift my own talk towards communities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Monica Sanders. I attend Lewis Palmer. And I was wondering what your opinion was on population policies and how they impact birth rates, including Denmark's policies.
Okay. Does Denmark have a policy of tax breaks, childcare, and those things? Is this what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, great question. So this is the hottest topic right now. I get 3 journalists calling a week on this. It is on fire. And everybody wants there to be an answer that says, here's what you do to turn the dial. I actually think, wow, what if I've been part of the problem because I said I picture these things as 3 dials, and if you want the volume higher on your radio, you just stick your hand out and you turn the knob. But guess what you can't do? If you want fertility rates higher, you can't just turn the knob. And that's what politicians are dealing with today. They're worried about low fertility rates because it shifts that age structure. It means fewer people in the working age population to support increasing numbers of older people, which is actually totally like 2 sides of things, because then the environmental people are saying, yay, and then the economic people are saying, oh no. Policies that try to provide, we call them carrots, carrots versus sticks, tax breaks, cash for childcare, things like that. Those are great for making having a family easier. They make it cheaper for people to have families. They kind of ease the perpetual work-life imbalance, but they don't raise the fertility rate. And that is the puzzle where everyone is at right now. We've seen even in Finland, which has these policies like Denmark, their fertility rate's 1.3 children born per woman, which is really low. So I'm always advocating, do these things because they improve well-being. Don't do them because you're trying to turn a dial.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Kayla. I go to Air Academy High School, and I was wondering, since this is an election year in the U.S., what should voters be looking for in terms of, looking and listening for in terms of immigration and growing and shrinking population in the U.S.?
Ooh, great question. So we're non-political here, but I can tell you the one thing we do advocate for always is data and evidence. And I think that PRB's mission is more important than ever because we are constantly saying, turn it back to the data and evidence. So that's actually what I would say to look for. And as we know from debates and media, sometimes data and evidence are not the highest value in what people say, but keep checking that because the information is out there and finding trusted sources like PRB and lots of others, that's the place to look. We actually have a fact sheet out on immigration, I think. I want to say it came out last week. What's it called? Who are America's immigrants? So yeah, you could see, this is our website. This week, if you went to our homepage, we got the data sheet, something on U.S. Census in Africa, and who are America's immigrants. So that would be something that you could check out.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ian Peterson, and I go to Sciubba Charter High School. My question for you was, is there a direct correlation in between global events and fertility rates?
Oh, that's a really great question. No, not necessarily. In fact, sometimes things we would expect to happen don't happen. There were years in there where we would see, demographers would see these little spikes in birth rates, and they'd figure out that 9 months before that there was a storm where the electricity went out. And you'd say, oh, look at that. Now it's unpredictable. So sometimes in conflict settings, people lose access to contraception, and therefore you would expect more pregnancies. But then sometimes it's lower because other factors would intervene in there. So while we know that there are lots of reasons to expect there to be certain outcomes, it is not always the case that there are. COVID was interesting because I think we still don't have great data coming outside of COVID on migration, so TBD on that. But on fertility rates, we knew they went down, partly even though people were home together, more opportunity, they felt dismal about the future, and so they would postpone having children. Those mostly rebounded to where we expected them to go, but they didn't go way up afterwards. And I think that's because if you zoom out, you see that COVID kind of accelerated a trend that was already heading towards lower fertility rates. But that's a great question. I think there's still a lot more to be done on it.
Thank you endlessly.
Hi, my name is Mason, and I go to Air Academy. What I was wondering is, you were talking about the dial a little bit earlier and how that doesn't solve everything. What would be the solution to increase fertility rates?
You know, I won't ask you this because you're a young person, but imagine me asking, maybe a friend of yours this, what would it take for me to get you to have a kid? That's really what we're asking. So this is the difference between talking about things in the aggregate and the abstract and then down to it. Think about the people, all of your neighbors. What will it take to get you to have a kid, or have one more kid, or to have one now, or to wait 5 years? It is so complex. And I think with political science and with policy making, you want it to be 1 or 2 variables as the main explanatory variables, because then you can put policies in place on that. What we're finding at this moment is that there is a huge menu of reasons why people are choosing to not have kids. They have to do with housing costs. They have to do, in the United States, we have lots of people with a college education and not enough great jobs for them. very few people who've gone into the trades, but lots of jobs available for that. We've got student debt. We have views about the future. We have changing values. It doesn't look very fun to be a parent. It looks a lot more fun to go do some of the other things that we see on social media. Is there a role for social media in this? Could it be that technology has taken us away from relationship building, which is required for baby making? So these are all questions that we have been chewing over, and there's not just one of them. There's a decline in religion. There's a decline in community connection. All of these are factors that up in the data, but so when you're trying to do policies around them, how do you convince young people that children are super fun despite all the bad things they hear, and so they should have them? Do we want politicians to try to convince us that? I don't know. So, sorry that there's no good answer, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mal from Sciubba Charter High School. Thank you, first of all, for taking time to answer questions for us. My question is, what do you think the ideal replacement rate is? Because you said that 2 out of 3 people live somewhere with a lower replacement rate. Like, do you think it should be higher, you know, with sustainability or lower? Like, what do you think would be best?
That's a great question. You know, I've actually never answered that before for various reasons, but I'll give you an answer on it. The rate doesn't matter as much when we're willing and able to change our structures. For example, we've got social security systems in the US that they run out of money because they're built on what's called pay-as-you-go. Lots of people feeding into the system to support the people outside of it. If you can change that, then who cares if the fertility rate changes? But again, political scientists here in me knows, we're not going to put in place these kinds of things. I think given environmental issues, given political issues, etc., below replacement, but not super low, seems to be a nice little sweet spot for a society where it's not as, the changes in age structure are not as painful economically and socially. Yeah. So we're not bad in the US. We're looking at 1.6 to 1.8. That's a sweet spot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Theron Rochette from Sciubba Charter High School. I was curious, I know you said to Ian that there isn't too much information on how COVID affected migration. I was curious what information we do know on how it affected migration.
We know during the height of the pandemic, we know a lot about it because it stopped. So we can see in the data that it was just a stop. We don't really have updated data since then on what does it look like maybe for 2023 or 2024. It looked to be like it had, kind of like fertility rates, it looks like it mainly rebounded to where it was before, which is why I feel good, confident in continuing to present data that says it's just under 4% of world population of migrants.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Savannah Holland. I go to Lewis Palmer High School. As a Southern girl myself, I was wondering why the population growth rate is so different between the regions of the United States and how much it has to do with the movement of people within the country.
Yeah, so movement within the country is absolutely what made the biggest difference for the South versus other regions. And it's cost of living really is a big part of it. Some of it may be some weather. You know, you do see Florida's growth rate in population was up from older people. So who moved there? Texas was up from younger people. So it's different things, but cost of, you usually can get, housing is more plentiful and cheaper. Cost of living is often lower. There's been a vibrancy around business there. Some of it is due to lower taxes in those states. I know I personally just moved from a state that had no income tax to one of the higher tax areas in the US. And those things make a difference as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, I'm Angelina John from Fountain
Oh, can you put your mouth a little closer to the mic? Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Angelina John from Fountain Valley School. I was wondering in future 50 years, if there's a technology that can replace pregnancy for a person to grow children, that means we don't really require to have a family, and that is legal and well spread in the current advanced but low fertility rate countries, how will this impact the population among these countries while there's still a growing price of raising children due to the expensive competition for the limited access to education?
Okay, I had a hard time hearing, but I think I got, what if we have this technology where it basically we can make, what if we can manufacture babies in the future? Does this solve everything? This is where I want us as a society, and I'm always saying this in the media, and I'm saying it to politicians any chance I get, to shift from thinking about numbers to thinking about well-being. There's no country I ever visit where the government really wants any babies. They always want just certain babies. And I'll let you infer that depending on the different country, there's always an element of origin, ethnicity, race, income, education, all of the religion, all of that comes into place there. So I think I would not want to live in a world where well-being wasn't the main factor. We want the children that are born to be wanted and to grow up in loving homes and have opportunities. And so I think it might provide more potential warm bodies for workers, but it also doesn't tell us anything about whether or not these kids would have the right skill set for the labor market. And in that case, does it matter anyway?
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have time for 3 more questions, so I think 2 on this side and then 1 on that. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Jada Roberson. I'm from Lewis Palmer High School, and my question was, how do policies involving abortion laws affect certain factors of population growth, like infant and maternal mortality rates? And do you think this is an issue that causes concern on a large scale?
That is a great question. We do see in the data, and in fact, if you look on PRB's website, there should be a short article and link to a webinar that we did on what were the data coming out of it. We do see a rise in maternal mortality. You're starting to see these stories come out in the news. That does show up in the data. And so that is a large-scale concern, and it is a concern worldwide. And just to point out that sometimes it is the case that women who already have children and who don't have that access will die. So, there's a rainbow of people who are affected by that. I think what concerns me about the way the conversation is going in the media these days is that it is much more about I'm trying to put it in a delicate way, but I'm sure you've seen it. Okay, let's just go with a Taylor Swift post on a childless cat lady. It's become so politicized. When I started studying this issue 20 years ago, for reasons that we'll go into here, I counted the countries in the world that were old countries, median age of 35 and higher, what proportion of them were democracies? And at that time, there were only 3 countries total who were old, who were not democracies. Today, a quarter of the countries who are old are not democracies. We hope that in democracies there are checks and balances on what a government can do, and if they want to incentivize births, that may or may not be the case, but in non-democracies, it's definitely not the case. And so I'm a student of population history. Many of you know about China's policies that they had to restrict births. One-child policy is an example of that. There were also forced sterilizations in India. All throughout history, we've seen examples of governments caring so much about population that they're willing to suspend rights in order to get an outcome that they desire. I think it's important for us to avoid that as an outcome and keep that focus there on rights.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Justice Guthrie from Sciubba Charter High School, and based off something you mentioned earlier, I was curious about your opinion if implementing and or providing better access to basic and higher education in less developed populations would decrease fertility rates.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we do see that, absolutely. So I think of this kind of trifecta of policies where the byproduct of that is lower fertility rates, more education, just a high school education. Is amazing for women, opportunities to earn income outside the home, and ending child marriage. Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elle Gustin from Lewis Palmer High School, and I was wondering if you feel that there's a direct correlation between education and birth rate.
Yeah, there's a complicated one. So it matters if we're talking about super high fertility rates and educating people into high school, like this question that was just asked here. When that education is put in place, we see it go down. We have had mixed evidence, though, on, let's take a place where it's already low, like the United States, and we want to say, is it the case that women with the least education have the most kids, women with PhDs have a fewest number of kids? Totally peer-reviewed research on these things shows two things. There's been a U-curve before, which says, actually, wealthier women with education were having more children for a little while. There's a fresh paper that says, no, it is linear. So that's what's hard about being in the data and evidence business, is sometimes there's two conflicting data and evidence. I think if we zoom out, it's fair to say that yes. Now, the one thing is maybe surprising, though, the difference in the number of children between the most educated, PhD level, and the least educated, some high school, is not as high as it used to be. So it might be one child difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know we're at the end right now, but a couple of people in my group for Sciubba Charter High School are wondering this question, so I'll make it quick.
Sure.
Some believe having more people on Earth makes it feel like we become less important individually. Do you have any positive perspective to tell those who are currently thinking this?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think going back to that argument I made about community, I think there's as much as I've spent a career teaching international, I was international studies, environmental studies professor, so I say think globally all the time. Thinking globally, I think, is where you get this downside that you said. When we are on our phone, I'm surrounded by so many devices right now, it's insane. When we're on these things, and the iPad and the computer, I think we're thinking globally. That's part of an evidence of that. Things we can learn, sure, I don't have to tell you all of that, but it also removes us from the human day-to-day. I would encourage everybody, when you go get those jobs, try to work from the office. Don't just look for remote work. These are little things where I think we've just lost so much of this human connection. And of course, data and evidence, there's research on how that's affected us in terms of our mental health. So I would love to see a shift in that, more local connection, community building, and actual face-to-face.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Those are wonderful questions. Dr. Sciubba, I just want to thank you for making the time and sharing, yourself, your knowledge, and we appreciate it. So let's all give her one more hand.
Great questions also.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, at this time, we need everybody to go back to the lobby so that we can set up for the next session. Thank you.